Good afternoon. My name is Maya Rockeymoore, President and CEO of the Center for Global Policy Solutions. We are dedicated to driving society toward inclusion by advancing health, education, economic, and civic success for vulnerable people. We're very pleased that you've joined us today to have a discussion about our recently released report. Overlooked but not forgotten, Social Security lifts millions more children out of poverty. I was at a recent event where we had about 100 people listening to the release of this report. And I asked the audience members how many of you knew that children were receiving Social Security. No one raised their hands. I also asked how many of you recall hearing about children in the great Social Security debates that have been happening over the past decade. Again, no one raised their hands. This report steps into the void to provide an unprecedented look at how the Social Security program helps 3.2 million children annually who live in extended families where someone receives Social Security benefits. And we already know that another 3.2 million children receive these benefits directly. This webinar will discuss Social Security's vital role in maintaining economic security for all generations, but especially for our nation's youngest participants. It will also include testimony from people who benefit from Social Security indirectly. So it is my pleasure that we have a stellar lineup of presenters and discussants, and we will start the conversation, and I will introduce them in the order that they will present. First, we'll have Sarah Murphy-Gray. She is a Senior Policy and Program Associate at the Center for Global Policy Solutions, where she leads the Center's Closing the Racial Wealth Gap initiative, along with several other programs through research and policy analysis. She is the co-author of the report Overlooked But Not Forgotten, Social Security Lifts Millions More Children Out of Poverty. She will be followed by Dr. Henry Aaron. He is a noted healthcare expert at Brookings. He focuses on reform in healthcare financing, public systems such as Medicare and Medicaid. He is an expert on Social Security, and he also focuses on tax and budget policy. From 1990 through 1996, he was the director of the Economic Studies program at, and he will tell you. Bruce Lesley is the president of First Focus, a nonpartisan advocacy organization dedicated to making children and families the priority in federal policy and budget decisions. He has more than 25 years of public policy experience at all levels of government and a demonstrated commitment to making children's lives better. Bruce Lesley directs all aspects of policy development and focuses also on the internal operations at First Focus. And Bruce will be followed by Kiana Green-Page. She is a Senior Communications Specialist for SEIU's Retirement Security Campaign. For the past 4 years, Kiana has helped to amplify the voices of working parents, grandparents, and millennials who are fighting for the right to retire with dignity after a lifetime of hard work. She's a journalist and graduate of Benedict College in Columbia, South Carolina, and she'll share stories of people for whom Social Security has helped as indirect beneficiaries. And finally, and last but not least, we'll hear directly from someone who has received Social Security benefits herself. Tanisa Smith-Sims is a telemetry technician living in Las Vegas. A former recipient of Social Security survivor benefits, she is an advocate for protecting and expanding the program. And she's the wife and mother of 3 and lives by the motto, it's not where you start, but where you finish that counts. So first we'll start with Sarah Murphy-Gray. Sarah?
Hi, everyone. I just want to thank you again for joining our webinar. I'm really excited today to share with you some of the findings that we have from the Overlooked But Not Forgotten report, Social Security Lifts Millions More Children Out of Poverty. So, as our first slide indicates, in 2014, approximately 6.4 million children benefited from Social Security directly or indirectly, representing 9% of all U.S. children under the age of 18 and 11% of all Social Security beneficiaries. And the interesting thing to note about this is that the majority of the increase is due to the growing number of children who are indirect Social Security beneficiaries from 2001 through 2014. And next, as household incomes have stagnated or declined over the past few decades, Social Security income has become a more important component of financial resources for children and families that receive direct and indirect benefits, contributing roughly 39% to family income in 2014. This is true for all racial and ethnic groups, and particularly for African American children, where benefits contribute 46% to family income. Further, the average monthly benefit of those children who benefit directly is roughly $548, just to put it in a larger perspective. Further, child benefits are a major source of income for families receiving Social Security, and on average, they account for more than half of a family's Social Security income.
His name is Elizabeth Wade, and she is coming to us as an internship as part of her master's, which is now in public analysis.
Excuse me, this is Hank Aaron. It might be a good idea if people who aren't speaking muted their phones, because there's a good deal of feedback coming through.
I wanted Mindy looped in.
Yeah, okay.
Because she's our intern coordinator.
Okay, I don't know if Gracie did that or not. Probably not, but I can loop Mindy in. And I know that
Social Security substantially reduces poverty rates among all children and families that receive benefits by almost 20%. For African American children, the poverty rate would increase to nearly 58% without Social Security benefits, an increase of more than 17 percentage points. This is the same percentage point increase for Latino children, whose poverty rate would increase to nearly 45% without Social Security benefits.
I'm already in.
So, well, super.
So if you connect with Mindy.
Okay. There's Mindy here.
And finally, what I'd like to point out is really the percentage of children who live in multiple generation households in the United States. There has been a rising trend from 2001 to 2014 of those who live in multi-generation households, with the highest group who live in multi-generational households actually being African American children, who currently have 16.8% living in multi-generational households. And also, the large majority, which is almost 2/3 of indirect child beneficiaries, live in multi-generational households. And this is to note Social Security child beneficiaries, that is over 2/3. And really what this represents is that a large number of children, especially those who are in multi-generational families, are impacted by Social Security, and especially those who are indirect beneficiaries. And so with that, I will pass it on to our next presenter. Thank you.
Henry Aaron.
Okay. Most people think of Social Security as primarily a retirement program. That was revealed by the report that at the group that was asked whether they were aware that children received benefits. Few people raised their hands. And it is true that Social Security, 2/3 of the benefits roughly, go out to under the so-called old age insurance program, which is for people who have reached age 62 and are eligible then to claim benefits. It's true that even such households, in such households, there may be minor children, and so some children benefit because they're part of a family that's receiving retirement benefits. But 2/3 of Social Security benefits go out under the disability insurance program and under the survivors program. People who die before they reach retirement age leave dependents, former dependents behind them. Many of them will be children. In fact, Social Security survivors insurance is the largest program of life insurance by far in the nation. Many children therefore qualify for benefits through that part of the program. And then, of course, there's disability insurance. people become disabled in the course of their working lives. Many, to a greater degree now than in the past, are becoming eligible at younger ages. Women are now eligible to a greater degree than they were in the past for disability benefits because they've worked more and have acquired eligibility. That was not the case when staying at home was more the norm than it is today. So many women who become disabled have dependent children, and these children also derive significant benefits. So the real accomplishment, I think, of this study is highlighting and calling attention to the public, presenting hard data, showing the degree to which Social Security actually does provide benefits to children as well as to older people. Giving the lie, I think, to the talk that has gone on at various points of generational warfare. Here's a program that provides benefits not just to the elderly, but simultaneously and through similar mechanisms to young adults and children as well. This is a generational compact, not a generational battle.
Thank you, Henry. Bruce? Bruce Lesley?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I was talking. I had the phone on mute. I wanted to focus on the report as well, and the value of this. I think this is I used to be on the staff director for this Senate Aging Committee, and this is definitely when we focused on issues around Social Security. I agree with all the previous speakers that the impact on children and families was often neglected or not thought about. And this report is really fantastic because it not only points out the direct effects on children, but also the indirect effects. So next slide. Child poverty in this country, 21% of the nation's children live in poverty, and in certain areas, like I think you can see, like the Richmond Times-Dispatch, 39% of the kids in Richmond live in poverty, and LeBron James did a recent event in Cleveland focusing on how the child poverty rate there is over 40%. So this is a huge problem facing the country. Next slide. This chart is from the Census Bureau, and it shows sort of the areas, and you can see in the dark red areas, those represent areas of the country where the child poverty rate is either 43.8% or higher. And you can see that definitely there's a southwest-southeast problem, but there's also pockets of child poverty in excess of 43% in other areas across the country. So there's a profound problem that we're facing, and it is nationwide, but there are definitely pockets where the problem is more intense. Next slide. I think another important area that the report really is fantastic at focusing on is the importance of addressing racial disparities. And so the report does talk about how Social Security has really helped address some of the problems with the racial disparity gaps you can see here. And so what these numbers show is that the blue bars represent kids below 100% of poverty, and the red bars represent kids below 200% of poverty. And you can see, nearly 2/3 of, or at least over 3/5 of kids who are either Black, Hispanic, or Native American live below 200% of the poverty line. And so the role that Social Security plays on helping these kids and families, both directly and indirectly, is important. Next slide. This represents this chart is also from the Census Bureau and shows that the current child poverty rate in this country is 21%. And so the next slide. This is a chart from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And what it this chart only represents the number of kids who are lifted out of poverty directly, but it's still very important. So over 1 million kids in this country are lifted out of poverty from Social Security. I think that for a lot of people, as Maya pointed out at the start, people don't recognize that. And I think the other important things about the report is it also shows that over 1 million kids are lifted completely out of poverty, but it also 3.2 million kids are directly impacted, and then 6.4 million kids are either directly or indirectly impacted by Social Security. So with the severe levels of child poverty in this country, I think the report is really great about pointing out Social Security's influence on helping families deal with that problem. Next slide. This is particularly important because the direction in which the former AFDC program, or Aid to Families with Dependent Children, and now called TANF, how the value of it when it was converted to a block grant, the value of its importance to children and families has diminished dramatically over time. And this is also from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and shows that the TANF block grant has fallen in value by 32% since 1996 because it's flat. And so you can see the differences in the level of impact TANF has on kids in poverty. And as the report today that the Center for Global Policy Solutions put out, Social Security now plays a bigger role than even TANF now in addressing child poverty. Next slide. And this is just going to talk about how this is very important in sort of a bigger package of thinking about how to address child poverty. And so in 1999, the UK adopted an effort to cut child poverty in their nation in half. And as you can see, their poverty rate was higher than that in the U.S. And in sort of creating a focus and on the issue, they've actually largely succeeded in cutting child poverty. And you can see in the U.S., we've had improvements for kids in some ways with things like Social Security, but then we've also had the sort of negative effect of what TANF has done. And so you can see the child poverty rate in this country has been largely flat for decades now. Next slide. We do a report annually called the Children's Budget, and we show sort of the percentage of funding dedicated to kids in the federal budget, and it's a little bit less than 8%. But the report does, I think there was at one of the briefings, people kind of talked about this and said that the report fails to take into the issues of Social Security, which is false. That actually, one of the important things about Social Security, it is one of the areas where there's actually been increases in funding for children, and that is represented in that report. Next slide. This chart just shows sort of the trend and kind of cries out for paying more attention to issues around things of importance to kids, including child poverty, and addressing those at the federal level. And the next slide. And you can see that of all new spending over the last 5 years, only 2% of that was dedicated to kids. So one of the things we think in this presidential election, you definitely saw, for example, Michelle Obama, and there's an interest, Hillary Clinton has dedicated her life toward addressing issues around kids. So there may be a window of opportunity to sort of really think about doing things. And so whether it's an expansion to Social Security or fixing the problems we have related to TANF, or other issues in the tax code, like increasing the child tax credit or something along those lines, or making it more refundable. Those are things that I think would be very important to really kind of making more progress toward reducing child poverty in this country. And this report really highlights the important role that Social Security plays in that. There's legislation just wanted to highlight for people on the call that's called the Child Poverty Reduction Act that would establish a child poverty target and look at sort of very different options. And then the last slide is a quote from Marion Page from UC Davis about children and kind of the role that we need to think about in terms of their lives. With that, I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Thanks, Bruce. Kiana.
Good afternoon. Thank you guys for inviting SEIU to share stories about the importance of Social Security for our nation's children. In recent years, SEIU has been acting on our commitment to retirement security for all, which includes fighting to protect and expand Social Security for today's recipients and tomorrow's and future generations. Through our efforts, we have found that Social Security is something that connects Americans of all ages and backgrounds. Many of our members have benefited from Social Security survivor benefits directly and indirectly, including Andy Klatt, the picture you see here, who's an adjunct professor living in Boston. At 65, Andy knows how important Social Security is for both young and older Americans. He received benefits, survivor benefits as a teenager when his father died. Those benefits went towards his college tuition. Social Security also helped the Klatt family maintain its financial stability. Although he's reached full retirement age, Andy doesn't want to retire from his job at Tufts University until he's 70 so he can receive the maximum benefit. This is one of several reasons why he's a part of a growing movement of Americans calling for an expansion of Social Security. Andy urges lawmakers to remember that there are millions of families in our country who are just getting by. He says it's unacceptable for these families to be pushed into dire poverty following the death of a loved one. Social Security is critical for the next generation, he says. Robert Fairchild, an electrician living in Brookline, Massachusetts, also knows the value of Social Security for our nation's children after the loss of a loved one. In fact, he says he doesn't know what his family would have done without Social Security benefits. His father died in 1958, leaving his stay-at-home mother with 3 children, ages 4, 9, and 11. They received Social Security survivor benefits as minors and college students. Robert's Social Security benefits helped his mother provide for her family, and they also provided him with the money that he needed to be the first person in his family to attend college. He says Social Security also gave his family faith in our government, being there for its citizens. Now Robert is 68, and he's receiving Social Security retirement benefits, which he describes as not being a heck of a whole lot, unfortunately. However, he uses those benefits to help his daughter pay down her student loan debt. He does, however, worry about the future of Social Security, and he wants lawmakers to expand the program. For him, Social Security and a Social Security expansion would mean being able to fully retire in comfort, as well as the comfort of knowing that the program will be there for future generations. These two stories just offer a snapshot of how vital Social Security benefits are for our nation's children. I would like to invite you all to read more stories about Social Security and retirement security for working Americans on our online story bank, which is located on the address on this slide. And right now, I would also like to introduce Tanisha Smith-Sims, who can speak directly about the importance of Social Security for our nation's children. Tanisha?
Good afternoon. My name is Tanisha Smith-Sims. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to share my story. As a former recipient of Social Security benefits, I can tell you that these benefits mean the world to millions of children in our country. I began receiving Social Security survivor benefits after my father died at the age of 3. I didn't know at the time but this would be a source of stability during my childhood. I was raised in South Central Los Angeles. It was an unstable environment, but my life became really rocky when I was 13. My mother died and I became more rebellious. I ended up in a group home. My life became even more challenging a year later when I became a teen mom. Despite the obstacles that I faced, I always knew that I wanted something better for myself and my child. I took classes and moved out at the age of 19. My Social Security benefits became really important for me during this time in my life. I was trying to pay rent but didn't have the job skills or family members to fall back on. For my Social Security, I was able to show my landlord that I had a stable income, and that Social Security provided me what I needed to get my life back on the right track. My survivor benefits also gave me access to get help for my dyslexia. Today, my life is totally different. I've earned several certificates in the medical field, and I have a great union job. I am happily married with 3 children, and I have been recognized by Congress during the Breakfast of Heroes program. However, I haven't forgot where I came from or how important the role of Social Security played in my life. I also know that this program will be there for me in the future when I retire. That's why I stand up with working mothers, fathers, grandparents, and young Americans, call on Congress to protect and expand Social Security. It is important for them to remember that we are real people that are affected by their decisions. Social Security isn't a handout, it is a hand up. Social Security recipients aren't lazy people. We are Americans who pay our taxes and earn a decent retirement. We are veterans who have fought to protect everyday freedom. We are Americans born with disabilities or become disabled due to unfortunate circumstances. And we are children who deserve a shot at a good future regardless of our past. Thank you.
Thank you, Tanisha. And I'd like to thank all of our speakers for actually speaking through toilet flushes and conversations. And I'd like to actually reiterate Henry's earlier request that folks who are not speaking to mute their lines so that we can actually hear the questions. I'm going to start the questions by asking Henry to clarify how many children or what percentage of children in America are actually eligible for Social Security benefits. I think people don't understand that how you actually establish the fact that you have eligibility for Social Security.
Well, let me start with the beginning. Most newborn children now receive a Social Security number before they leave to go home with their new mother and father. It's a standard part of hospital practice today. To know what proportion of children are covered, the best thing to do is look at the proportion of adults that are covered for Social Security. Something on the order of 96 or 97% of all jobs are covered under Social Security. That doesn't mean necessarily that 96 or 7% of people who hold those jobs are currently eligible, because you have to have worked a certain number of months or quarters in order to become eligible. The requirement is for disability is relatively tighter. You have to have worked in 5 of the last 10 years in Social Security employment. And for survivors' benefits, you have to have worked. There's no recency of work requirement, but you do have to have a sufficient number of quarters to have become eligible to receive retirement or survivors' benefits. So I'm not giving you a precise number, and the reason is I don't know the precise number. But over the course of their lives, nearly all adults become eligible for benefits. And the reason is, even if they haven't worked enough quarters yet, they will over a period of time, even if they're in one of that small fraction of jobs not currently covered by Social Security. At some point in their lives, they will be working in jobs that are covered and will acquire eligibility. So I feel completely safe in saying that the proportion of children living in households where a person is eligible to receive Social Security, and if the circumstances arise and they need it, the children will benefit from it, that proportion is well over 90%. There are some gaps, and the reason they arise because eligibility for Social Security is tied to a connection to the labor force. But the story is that overall, if you want to look at the single largest and most powerful instrument for keeping or moving children out of poverty, the single largest public program for doing that, Social Security is the largest by far and has a much more powerful effect in removing children from poverty than any other.
Bruce, given what Henry just said, that last statement, why do you think that more child anti-poverty advocates and hunger advocates and other child welfare advocates don't understand or know about or advocate on behalf of Social Security?
Yeah, I think a big for the children's advocacy community, there's so many issues that everyone is faced with for children. So, and things like early childhood and education predominate, and so as a result, there's actually very few advocates for children that even focus on poverty. And as my slide earlier pointed out, kids have a much higher poverty rate than anyone in the country, and so there's a lot of awesome advocates for who advocate on poverty issues, but there's not a lot of focus even among the kid groups, just because there's not a lot of resources that are so that's part of it. There's not the funding to do advocacy around it, but also there's the kid groups are are spread so thin, and then third, I actually think that this report is really enormously beneficial, because I think people might have known some of the direct benefits, to some extent, but I don't think people had really thought through the indirect benefits, and I think that's really one of the great things this report brings to the fore, and particularly things around the growth in the number of children who are actually being raised by their grandparents, and those kinds of things that also is highlighted in the report.
Bruce, I'd just like to follow up. When you highlight a slide that talks about how much Congress invests in kids, I think it was less than 8%, and then you reflect back on what Henry was talking about in terms of intergenerational warfare, is there anything you want to say about tactics for actually forming common cause across generations to actually support children while also supporting people across all stages of the lifespan?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we in our advocacy we talk about how money matters, and that it matters for both grandparents and their grandkids, and so we talk about sort of the intergenerational aspects of making sure that investments are good for senior citizens and kids, and I think that the profound changes that have happened since the 1960s for senior citizens are something that kid advocates should look to and learn lessons from, because we've made enormous progress for senior citizens, and we certainly have more ways to go. But meanwhile, there's been this stagnation for kids, and it's largely because of I think there's growing understanding that TANF has really not served kids very well, and the changes that were made to it in 1996. And so trying to learn some lessons from what senior citizens have accomplished over the years, and also, what kinds of things can we do for kids that mimic that. And Social Security is a good example of that. Like people know of the benefits to senior citizens, but are less understanding of that for kids. And maybe there's some things we need to do to tweak Social Security to actually even improve it further for both seniors and kids. I also think, just let me add one more thing. I also think that, on the flip side, there's not a lot of, there's not enough back and forth between groups. So as child advocates, do letters in support of, CHIP or, Medicaid, for example. A lot of senior groups don't necessarily sign on those. They do them separately. And so we don't hold hands and do things together as much as we should. And I think that's something that we should work on and see if, between everyone, there's a lot of intergenerational programs like Medicaid and food stamps that also very important to alleviating poverty and important to both seniors and kids that we should do more joint advocacy on.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. And Kiana, can you tell us more about why SEIU decided to prioritize the expansion of Social Security?
Well, one of the reasons, and I would probably say the top reason, is because as in particular with our retirement security campaign, what we're finding as policies chip away at employee benefits, more people are becoming reliant on Social Security to meet their needs in their later years. And an expansion would not only boost benefits for today's retirees, but it would help ensure that as our dependency on the program continues to grow, that the program would continue to address those needs of working Americans.
Right, and one of the policy recommendations that were made for expansion in the report was not only just expanding Social Security benefits, but making sure that we restore the benefit that allowed young people to actually continue to receive their survivor benefit payment while they attended college. This was something that used to be a feature of the program prior to the early 1980 reforms, and it was taken away in the early 80s. And so many advocates are actually pushing for the restoration of the student benefit. That's what it's called. At this moment, I'd like to actually open up the questioning to audience members. It has been brought to all of our attention that nobody is on mute, so everybody can be heard. If you just identify your name, your organization, and address your question, it would be great. Thanks.
Could people please mute their phones and have the background noises?
Mm-hmm. Are there any questions from those assembled? Well, then I have one more. Sarah, you were actually speaking earlier about the heavy reliance of children of color on Social Security benefits. Can you give us some more specific statistics in terms of how it affects these particular families?
Absolutely. So one of the statistics that I mentioned earlier is that for Social Security beneficiaries, child beneficiaries, if those benefits were to somehow go away, the poverty rates would be significantly higher for those groups of children. One of the ways that we see this impact most prominently is in that statistic, specifically because the poverty rate would become much higher for African American and Latino children, specifically higher than for white children or for children who define them or identify as other. And so what happens is the majority of African American children who were once Social Security beneficiaries would actually become impoverished, for lack of a better term. This would equal roughly 58% of black children who are currently benefiting from Social Security, both directly and indirectly. And just to bring this a step further, this is especially important for children of color who benefit indirectly. I don't think that we fully consider how much children who benefit indirectly really are impacted by this program. One important interview that I will point to within the report is that of Giovanni. He really benefited from Social Security not only through his sister, who is actually in a different program that's also under the branch of Social Security, but through his grandmother, who was on Social Security. And it was her income that actually helped to sustain a family of over 9 people. And it was that income that helped his family to stay afloat during a very hard time, what would have been a very hard time if it were not for those benefits. And you could look at any number of these interviews and see a lot of the same results. And so just to drive that point home, Social Security is so impactful for children of color, and I think that we can only scratch the surface through statistics of really understanding the impact that this has for black families in particular, but also for Latino families and for families who identify as other, which may include Asian American families, Native American families, and the list goes on and on. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. And Bruce, I'd like for you to speak to, you had coined a term, and I actually forgot the phrase for it, but it talks about how rising generations of children are disproportionately black and brown, and how policy decisions made today would disproportionately affect a cohort of youth tomorrow who look very different from today. What is that term?
Yes, Bill Fry has a book from the Brookings Institute called the Diversity Explosion, and he talks about the racial generation gap and sort of the gap between, he points out that kids below the age of 6 are now majority minority, and increasingly so, and so we need to be really paying attention to making better investments and greater investments. But also to the different types of investments we need to be making to make sure that we're addressing the race gap, and so racial disparities in terms of a lot of issues. And there's areas where we're actually seeing some really great progress. For example, in the area of health, the uninsured, because of Medicaid and CHIP, for example, in large part the uninsured rate among African American kids and white kids are now the same, and it's low. It's like 4 to 5%. Hispanic kids are a little bit higher, and that has to do with the need to do better outreach enrollment and also issues around immigration status. But we can do it. Like we can succeed in addressing racial disparities, and so in areas around poverty and education and other areas, we need to be making greater investments and need to be really demanding, for example, even in public financing of schools, equity. And that's, that we have a long way to go, but that's one of the areas that we're really pushing.
And yet, Henry, we continue to have policy debates, for example, about the future of Social Security that really doesn't talk about the nation's changing racial and ethnic demographics, what that means for the program, and what kinds of policy considerations need to be given in any reform effort that takes into account the rise of these extremely vulnerable households. Why do you think that is, and what do you think can be done to change that?
Well, let me push back a bit. I think one of the reasons for the absence of the discussion you're describing is that Social Security actually is pretty well designed to cope with and respond to the demographic changes you're describing. It doesn't do everything under the sun that one could want good public policy to do, but it does a lot. And what it does in particular is provide people replacement for marketplace earnings if they lose them. They can lose them because they get old and elect to, or are no longer able to continue working, because they become disabled, because a breadwinner dies. Now, insofar as that program operates, it's admirably blind to sex and to race or national origin. It doesn't take care of undocumented aliens. That's a separate issue, and not something that Social Security is well constructed to deal with. But it is well constructed to deal with the fact that some groups earn less than other groups do. People of color earn less on average than do whites and Asians. But it provides a higher replacement rate, a higher ratio of benefits to average earnings for people with low earnings than for high earnings. It's flexible with respect to retirement benefits. If you need to retire early, you can do so and claim benefits. To be sure, they're reduced. And the reason they're reduced is that you're going to be receiving them on average for a longer period of time if you claim early than if you claim late. It doesn't adequately recognize that life expectancy is related to average earnings levels. So low earners tend to die younger than high earners do on the average. And the system doesn't adjust for that. But it does a lot. And I think one of the reasons, perhaps the major reason why the discussion you're describing has not taken place is that it is flexibly designed and does fill in where things need to be filled in to a remarkable degree.
Even in terms of family formation, we know that the rise of for example, single-headed households has become more commonplace, and the notion of adequacy of benefits for these kinds of family formations being one that has been questioned. Do you think that it's adequate for that kind of family structure?
It does not. First of all, with respect to family structure, the main question and the main feature of the system since its inception was that if there was a non-earning spouse, the non-earning spouse got an extra benefit. And that's true whether the non-earning spouse is a man or a woman. It's usually historically been a woman. Increasingly, that's no longer as relevant an issue as it was in the past, because women and men now have similar labor force participation, and most women, as well as most men, are going to end up getting benefits in their own right, not in based on the record of their spouse. For single-parent families, they frequently have lower earnings, and hence when they get to be retirement age, usually by the time people reach retirement age, not always, but usually, dependents are grown. But low earners get a higher replacement rate than do higher earners. But there is one issue that is a continuing and vexatious problem, and nobody has come up with a really ideal solution, and that is increasingly people marry and split. And the rules under which a non-working or a low-earning former spouse is able to claim benefits are problematic in many ways. I think that's an area that deserves a lot of attention and a lot of study. Specifically, if you are if you are divorced after marriage, you can claim benefits on your own earnings record, or you can get a spouse's benefit based on your former spouse's earnings, but only if you've been married for 10 years. 9 years and 364 days won't do the trick. That's a real problem because divorce is frequent and it frequently occurs before 10 years. And so spouses who are earning less, typically women, can end up with not much in the way of benefits so when they get to be older or if they become disabled.
Thank you. Any questions before I turn it over to Tanisha for a last and final comment? Any other questions from the audience members? So Tanisha, in one word, I would love for you to tell us about how you feel about Social Security and why, and give us any parting words of wisdom from someone who has directly been a child Social Security recipient.
Yes, thank you. I think Social Security is very vital. Social Security survivor benefits. And one of the things that I like to stress is that it definitely gives young children the opportunity to be able to help their families, for them to be able to provide for them, to help to go to school. I know it helped me to go to school. And one of the things I like to make clear, too, is people on Social Security benefits are not lazy people. I think there's like a stigma. They're not lazy people. They're working Americans who pay taxes. So just to give our children in America a fair shot, and to remember they need an opportunity as well. Thank you so much today for allowing me to share my story again.
And thank you, Tanisha, and all of today's presenters for a fabulous conversation and presentation of the facts about Social Security, children, poverty. We really appreciate your participation, and we invite everyone who's listening in to visit www.globalpolicysolutions.org to read the full report, Overlooked but Not Forgotten. Thank you for your time, and everyone take care. Have a great summer.